Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Tracy Peterson, and I am the manager of the Education Outreach section in the Department of Global Communications at the United Nations. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion of the 5th episode of the series Enslaved, the Lost History of the Transatlantic Slave Trade. The United Nations Outreach Program on the Transatlantic Slave Trade and Slavery is guided in 2021 by the theme, Ending Slavery's Legacy of Racism, a Global Imperative for Justice. The theme reflects the global movement to end injustices whose roots lie in the slave trade. The theme highlights the importance of educating about the history of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery so that we can acknowledge slavery's impact on the modern world and take action to address its long-lasting effects. Over the last few months, with the generous support of Fremantle and Associate Producers Limited and Cornelia Street Productions, we've been able to offer the screenings of each episode of Enslaved at the United Nations, and we're very grateful to them for enabling us to do that. Today we're going to be discussing episode 5, as I said, and there is still time for you to watch episode 5, I think, for the next 2 days. And please just, communicate with us if you haven't been able to see it, and we can make sure you get the link. So today's discussion focuses, as I said, on episode 5, which is entitled Resistance. And we will, as we always do, record today's discussion and we'll share this with you in the course of the next few weeks. We invite you to share your comments, your ideas, and ask questions by writing them in the Q&A throughout today's event. We know that Africans did not accept enslavement as their fate, and that throughout the 4 centuries that this barbaric and violent system existed, Africans resisted at grave danger to themselves. In today's discussion, our esteemed panel, will discuss the many ways in which Africans resisted and the network of activists who work together to help the enslaved reach freedom. Our esteemed panel today, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you. We have Peter Flegel, who is the Executive Director of the Department of Canadian Heritage, Aaron Niski, who is the Executive Producer of the Enslaved series, Simcha Jakubowicz, the Series Director, SaladinAllah, a descendant of a survivor who found freedom in Canada, John Polasek, an expert on sunken slave ships in the Great Lakes, Kelly Achenbach, Vicar of St. John's Episcopal Church in Ohio City, and Kramer Wimberly, the lead dive instructor, Diving with a Purpose. Now, before we go any further with today's discussion, we would like to show, for those of you who possibly are encountering Enslaved, the series, for the first time, just to show you a very brief trailer of the series, which we believe is a useful way to begin the conversation. So I'm going to ask Alex, our technician, to please go ahead and screen that for us.
I've always been intrigued by the Atlantic slave trade. There are very few stories about what happened to the people on their way over and what happened to the people who didn't survive. We thought it was worth telling that story. We think, from our estimation,
12 million Africans were trafficked. More than 2 million died en route.
buried at sea somewhere.
We're actually looking at the site of one of the greatest crimes in history.
This is currency created to buy a human being.
The ocean holds stories that haven't been told.
Finding something down there, it's gonna pop the lid off this story.
This is ground zero for the whole transatlantic slave trade.
It's almost the capital of it. My ancestry started in Gabon from the Benga tribe.
The story of the slave trade is world history. The world bears responsibility for it. You have to come to terms with it. You have to confront it.
It's not something that was unique to America. It was a worldwide phenomenon.
It's such a powerful trailer. I would like to turn now to our next guest, who is SaladinAllah. And Saladin is, again, if you've seen the episode, you'll recognize him and his name. He's one of the presenters in episode 5. He is the third great-grandson of Underground Railroad freedom seeker Josiah Henson, who was an inspiration for Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, published 13 years before slavery was officially abolished in the United States. Saladin has published worldwide, print and online, and created various youth programs, projects, and initiatives. He founded the Atlantis School for Gifted Youngsters, and, not surprisingly, he is a recipient of the Martin Luther King Jr. Civil Rights Achievement Award. Saladin, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm in good company with some people that are doing some important work.
I wonder if you could tell us, Saladin, about the journey your Josiah Henson made, the obstacles he faced, and then if you could tell us a little bit about how you came to know this history.
Wow, okay. So to kind of put it in context, Josiah Henson was a forerunner of the Underground Railroad. When he made his journey in 1830, Harriet Tubman's name was Araminta at that time. She was still living plantation life. So one thing that I tell people all the time, the phrase Underground Railroad became popularized in the mid-1800s, but it literally took many years to develop that sophisticated network. Josiah Henson actually made that journey when he was 41 years old. So he lived most of his life as an enslaved person, and he took his 4 small children as well as his wife on that 600-mile journey because he was sold to his enslavers' brother's plantation in Kentucky. And when he made that journey, it took him an actual month before he arrived up here to Western New York, where I live at, and crossed over at the foot of Ferry, which is known as Broderick Park in Buffalo, New York, over to Fort Erie, and lived in a small community on the Canadian side known as Little Africa until he eventually moved further north and helped establish a settlement called the Dawn Settlement, where over 100 freedom seekers were able to make a home for themselves. He was also responsible for building the British American Institute, and he would also come into the United States in the role of an abolitionist as well. Learning about his story, he is part of my father's side of the family because my father's mother was born in St. Catharines, which is the same community that Harriet Tubman and other freedom seekers lived in, and she moved here into the United States in 1925. My father was born here in the United States, and he had 7 children, and I'm one of those children. This is a story that I learned as a child, and I'm thankful to have the type of parents that laid the foundation for me to develop a sense of cultural competence as well as social justice, where this was a sense of normalcy in my household. My mother, she's a social psychologist by trade, and my father, he was a tradesman, but he also collected African artifacts. So I grew up in an environment where on one side I had a DSM-4 that my mother would use in order to teach us about just the sociological and social psychological landscape of life. But then on the other side, my father would teach us about a lot of our classical civilizations and the contributions that we made to society. As I got older and I went away to college, it was at college where I really began to evolve, and through gaining knowledge of self through my Nation of the 5%, I was able to look beyond a lot of the more contemporary legal definitions of people of African descent as American descendants of slaves, or ADOS, as well as FBA, or Foundational Black Americans, to realize that we are connected to first world people as fathers and mothers of civilization, where knowledge and wisdom of humanity was actually founded. So since that time, I've been in the role of an educator. I teach early childhood development, and being involved in this project was something that is a part of my life trajectory in terms of my growth and development. And I appreciate just the opportunity to not just share that story of my family's journey, but also to be able to give people a sense that we all have these journeys of freedom. And it is that interconnectedness that we all share in terms of this story that allows us to build the type of bridges and not walls that keep us apart from one another.
Well, I think you have created such a legacy already, and your actions are such a tribute to the courage of your ancestors as they fought for their freedom, as they walked to their freedom. And I think, particularly for our audience who's not that familiar with the some of the names that you've mentioned, Lake Erie, and I think there may not be a complete understanding of just what it took to physically do that journey. I mean, he was walking, Josiah was walking, and you say carrying his children. I mean, he was walking for a month, and of course, it's not just a question of walking. I imagine that there are all sorts of fears that he has, real fears of the consequences of escaping. Could you share with us a little bit about some of the obstacles that he would have had to face?
Oh, wow, yeah. So at one point in his journey, his family needed water, and he didn't even have a container to be able to put water in, and he washed his boot out and was able to gather water in his boot to quench thirst of his family. At one part of his journey, when he reached Ohio, he was actually taken in and supported by indigenous people who lived in that area at that time, which was common when it came to freedom seekers, especially when you're talking about people who may have gone further south as opposed to north in search of freedom. And I'm speaking about people who were taken in by the Seminoles within the Everglades area of Florida, and also people who went down through Texas into Mexico. So part of his journey, he was also helped by a man named Captain John Burnham, who actually captained the ship called the School of Commerce. And the beautiful thing about the maritime aspect of the Underground Railroad is you have people who came to this land and boarded ships in the South as cargo, but disembarked on those ships as human beings. So it also speaks to the level of courage that captains like Captain John Burnham and others, who became a part of the Underground Railroad as well. Sometimes it's very difficult to wrap your mind around the type of challenges that he actually faced in that journey, because in a present day sense, it's oftentimes difficult to even conceptualize what it actually took to make journeys like that. One thing that I have also learned from that is not only a sense of resilience, but the sense of anti-fragility that comes along with making journeys such as that. Because it's similar to a person breaking a bone. Usually when that bone heals, it becomes much stronger than what it was to begin with. And that's one thing that I learned from his journey, just that sense of anti-fragility, and genetically, that is something that actually exists within me as well. And it gives me a sense of reference in terms of modern day challenges that I may face, and it puts it in a different type of context. If I know that my ancestor and ancestors went through various different trials and tribulations and made it through, then I know for a fact what my capacity is and my infinite potential to be able to meet those challenges themselves. With my children at school, one of the things that I tell them is it's important to learn about not only your parents, but also your grandparents and your great-grandparents, because your physical age is really an indicator of your reference library of life. So if you're 11 years old, you have 11 books in your reference library of life. You have some answers in those books. But wouldn't it be smart to talk to someone in your family that has 80 books? You might have somebody in your family that has 90 books. And what it allows you to do is to expand your reference library of life. And at the same time, this landscape that you may find yourself on today may be very similar to the landscape that some of your ancestors have traversed before you. So it gives you an advantage in terms of being able to be successful in your undertakings and meet your goals. So one of the greatest takeaways that I get from Josiah Henson's story is that sense of anti-fragility.